There's lots of tech companies out there, lots of companies building lots of different things. And one of the issues that engineers often concern themselves with is how do we make sure that these things can work with each other? How do we make sure that they're interoperable? It's even a hard word to say, let alone to actually pull it off in practice. So you've got to get these different kinds of technologies built in different places by different people to work seamlessly if the overall solution is to work. We have that in AI as well. To take one popular example now, think about the LLM companies. Let's think about OpenAI building ChatGPT or GPT 4.0 now, and then some other downstream company sourcing it, making various changes to it, so called fine tuning of that model for their purposes, and then going on to use it. One thing you might wonder about, and this is what David Danks and his colleagues are wondering about, is how do you ensure that not only are the technical specifications by each side compatible, but how do you make sure that the ethical standards are compatible? How do you know that an OpenAI or a Microsoft or a Google or a Meta or whatever it is, how do you make sure that the way that they built their technology that you are building on top of is going to uphold the same ethical standards? That's a pretty big deal if you've got, let's say, a low appetite for ethical and reputational risk in your organization, and you're using a model that you don't know really how it was designed or according to what, if any, ethical standards it was designed. That puts your organization at risk for doing the wrong thing, potentially. So, what are we supposed to do about this? This is what David Danks and his colleagues call the problem of ethical interoperability. Kind of a mouthful, but it's essentially, it focuses around, I would say, two questions, and he'll be able to, as you'll see, he'll say more about it himself. But how do we make sure that all these different organizations, with all their different ethical standards, with all their different design processes, all building towards a product or a set of products, how do we make sure we're all on the ethical same page? One issue is that there are IP and transparency issues. So, in order for different parties to come together to talk about how we're building this thing, different organizations have to be more or less transparent about the kinds of decisions that were made in building the part that they built. But then you run into certain issues around intellectual property. People don't want to, or organizations don't want to, give away their IP. And so that's an obstacle to having open conversations that actually conduce to getting on the ethical same page. There's a separate question that David and I discussed as well, which is who's to blame when things go ethically sideways? If there's all these people, this is called in philosophy the problem of many hands, as David mentions. If there are all these different organizations contributing different parts to the whole, and the whole goes sideways, how do we distribute responsibility across those different organizations who are responsible for different parts? One thing that we talk about in this context is a third party audit might be useful in this context. But one thing that David highlights that I find really interesting is that we don't really know, that is to say, we don't have strong empirical evidence for knowing what things ought to look like to make sure that things go ethically well. We've got hunches like, let's get a cross functional, diverse, great range of people in a conversation to yada, 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 yada. And we think, we might even believe that that's going to decrease the likelihood of things going ethically awry. But we actually don't have a tremendous amount of evidence on that front. As David says, we might think that there are certain processes that will lead to the result, but usually when we audit for process, it's because we know that that process systematically or tends to produce the kind of outcome that we want. In the case of AI ethics or AI ethical risk, we don't yet have those established processes that have empirically been shown to produce the kinds of outcomes that we want to create, or at least avoid the outcomes that we want to avoid. So the conversation is pretty wide ranging across these kinds of topics. Super fascinating. And interestingly, incidentally, you won't hear us talk about large language models in particular and the way that responsibility for how those are created and then later fine-tuned by other companies, because we had this conversation back in January. But it's just as relevant, if not more relevant today than it was then. Okay, that's all by preamble. I really hope you enjoy the conversation. If you've got questions for me, if you have a suggestion for a guest, if there's a topic that you want me to discuss at some point, please reach out to me at Ethical Machines, em@reedblackman.com, and I will take it into consideration. What more do you want? I can't make any promises right now. All right, let's get on with the conversation. David, thanks for coming back. Why don't you introduce yourself to the people and tell us about this issue about why ethical interoperability is a thing that you research with colleagues and talk about, write about.
So I think most people are familiar with the idea of sort of technical interoperability. That's the idea that, if we want to have one computer system work with another, they have to be able to communicate. They have to be interoperable. So they have to pass information using a standardized format. Or we can think about the interoperability of, say, in a military context, the radio systems, or in a law enforcement context, the interoperability of the radio systems of the police department, the fire department. How do they all manage to communicate without messing up the system, without having crosstalk and these kinds of things? Well, one of the things that's really happened over the last, I think, 5 to 10 years is there's been a very large shift in the technology industry away from companies that build everything in-house to a much more sort of a distributed economy, distributed ecosystem, where you have people producing, what is sometimes called AI as a service. And so the AI has to be able to just drop into some other company's HR software. Or we have people who are, building just the face recognition piece of it, and then they hand it off to a company that embeds that within a security system or something like this. And so there's a lot of attention that's being paid to the technical interoperability as we start to have this kind of distributed creation of AI systems. And what we're really interested in is, but what about the ethical interoperability of these distributed development? So let me give an example. Right now, many companies are starting to develop their own sets of ethical AI principles, things that they think, this is what responsible AI means to me. We could even look at the federal government, where we're starting to see the emergence of some guidelines and principles around that in light of the recent executive orders over the last couple of years. And these companies, even the US government, might turn to, just to name one of many, a company like Microsoft that has the Azure service that helps to build AI systems. Now, Microsoft has their own set of ethical AI principles. And so then the question of ethical interoperability is, how does the small company or the federal government know that what's being developed by Microsoft conforms to the company or government's ethical AI principles? I mean, we know that it's going to presumably conform to Microsoft's ethical AI principles because it's Microsoft doing it, Microsoft building it. And the question, though, is how could I know, as, say, a small startup that's using these services, using these technologies, how do I know that what's being built satisfies my ethical principles? Now, for some kinds of cases, that's probably going to be pretty easy, but the worry is that we can't just say, well, it satisfies somebody's principles, so that's good enough. Because that opens the door to a kind of ethical outsourcing, which is sort of the real risk that we worry about, is that companies will feel like they can, go find the one who has the weakest ethical AI principles, have them build something really terrible, hand it over to me, and I can go, well, it satisfied their principles, so it must be okay for me to use it. And so that's one of the big things we've been worrying about.
Right. So I mean, it seems like there's a number of things going on there. One example that you gave is just straight up procurement issues, I think, right? So some company, I'm an organization, maybe I'm a Fortune 500, I'm procuring an AI solution from, maybe it's a Microsoft or some other tech giant, maybe it's a startup or something in between. And what's the method by which we assess whether or not that AI meets our ethical standards? That's one issue. The second issue, and this is, I take it, the first thing that you talked about, is this issue about models are typically embedded in solutions, right? This is not just a sort of model laying around. It's embedded in the solution, like a hiring solution or a security solution. Those solutions are wholes made up of parts. So there's the model, there's other standards by which things get flagged, there's what happens when things get flagged, like if this person gets flagged outside of Madison Square Garden, they get detained or they get barred from entering, so on and so forth. And that's a slightly different issue because I think it's not just about procurement, it's about the something like the ethical credentials of the system of which the AI is a part.
Yeah, so I mean, the way that I would think about it is, as you said, first there is the procurement issue, and we should definitely dive deeper on that. The way I would think about the other is, in some sense, sort of the allocation of ethical responsibility, right? When something goes wrong with the whole, how do we think about who should do something differently, who should be held accountable for it, maybe even legally, but at the very least ethically, in terms of who should do something differently. So should I, as the person who built the face recognition system that gets deployed at, since you mentioned it, Madison Square Garden, to detect, people who have sued MSG and say, I'm sorry, you're not allowed to come into this concert, what is the ethical responsibility that I bear as the creator of that kind of a system?
And
So I think those are two important issues, but very much distinct, as you said.
yeah, and the latter issue about who bears responsibility, that comes up in my work with clients all the time. I mean, I was just talking with a client the other day where with procurement, they're completely on board with having a ethical risk due diligence process before it comes in-house. But when it comes to servicing a client, building a model for a client that they'll embed in the system, they're completely unreasonably, but we could talk about whether it's unreasonable, a little bit more permissive because they think, well, look, it's, it's up to our client. We can flag certain issues for them. We can flag, hey, if you use this to do X, you might wind up discriminating against people, or there's going to be false positives because it's impossible not to have false positives. And that could cause some downstream harm. So that company, and it's a multinational large company, they at most think that it's their responsibility to sort of warn or to give notice to their clients about the way in which the models might be used or the solutions might be used. But they have it, or their take is, it's ultimately the client's responsibility whether or not it's on the ethical up and up. Does that sound like a reasonable approach to you, or do you think that's to shirk too much responsibility? Depends on the context. What do you think?
Well, so in that case, and I definitely want to come back to the procurement issue because I think it's not as easy as perhaps your client thinks
Of course
to
not.
write procurement
Of course.
that touches on ethical issues. But I think in that case, it is going to depend at least a bit on the context. I think there is a question about what can be reasonably expected that the client will do with the system that I build. I do believe that I can be complicit in the wrongs that are committed by others if I facilitate them knowingly. Abetting a crime is nonetheless ethically problematic, even if I didn't commit the crime myself. And I think the challenge that arises is really twofold. One is actually sort of the other direction of the procurement issue, which is that oftentimes the person who's contracting with me to get a data science model is not necessarily going to want to tell me everything that they are doing. They might have very good reasons that they say, yeah, we need something that does this. Don't worry about what we're going to do with it. And it might not be because of anything nefarious. It might be simply because of competitive,
IP and that sort of thing.
Competition. Exactly. So, there's the challenge of how would I ever find out whether what they were about to do would go against my ethical principles. And then there's the context sensitive thing of, where do we draw the lines? I think many folks, so I do some work with, for example, the U.S. Department of Defense. I have colleagues who think that that is simply unethical, that to do any work with the DoD is to be complicit in the harms that obviously do occur. I look and say, well, the Department of Defense is the biggest supplier of healthcare in the United States. So it's not just a military, right? It's also an organization that does a lot of things where we can provide benefit to people. And so we need to be more thoughtful about it.
It's also the case that, look, if you want them to be better, ethically better, it makes sense to have, people who are looking at the ethical impacts of what they do. And you're not, of course, going to be able to eliminate the wrongdoing or the bad stuff, but you may well mitigate. And I've had the same complaint from a colleague about working with a mining company. They think mining companies are bad, climate change, yada, yada. They will not work with mining companies. But I said, look, they're going to use AI. They're going to do what they're going to do. There's no way I'm going to stop that. But maybe if I could, have them do it, they're going to do it, but they do it with less harmful impact. All right, that's better than nothing. What's the alternative? Just overthrow the mining industry, overthrow the Department of Defense, and they stop doing any bad things? It's not reasonable.
Yeah, I'm very sympathetic to that line. I mean, I can also imagine listeners who are, yelling at their device that they listen to podcasts on going, yeah, but, the line between being complicit and changing from within and these kinds of things, that's a very, very blurry line. And many people who thought that what they were doing was, changing systems for the better actually just ended up facilitating enormous harms. So I'm sympathetic to that, right? I don't want to deny that. At the same time, yeah, I do feel the pull of the how do we help people, maybe do this in a better way. But I think that this is ultimately, in many ways, a question of essentially professional ethics. Where do we each draw our lines? And where do we draw the lines as a company? Where do we draw the lines as individuals? Because, there are things that I would not do with the Department of Defense. There are opportunities that have arisen, and I have declined to participate because it was clear what it was going to be used for. And I think to come back to your original question about sort of ethical interoperability, what this is raising, I think, is a very vivid sort of way of thinking about this. That is, I have my ethical positions. The client for whom I am building the model has their ethical principles and positions. And what we need to do is basically find whether we can match those up. Are we working on a project where we both agree this is something legitimate to do? And the challenge of ethical interoperability is precisely that this is not an optional or negotiable step. That if we take seriously our ethical commitments, whether as individuals or as organizations, then it is incumbent upon us to actually take the time and energy to try to figure out whether, on the particular case we're looking at, the ethical principles of the different players that are cooperating to produce the technology, are they all agreeing about what it is to be ethical in this particular case? Obviously, they don't have to agree about what's ethical everywhere,
Sure.
but they really ought to agree about what's ethical in this particular case. Otherwise, one of the parties is going to be, perhaps unknowingly, perhaps unintentionally, essentially contributing to something that they, by their own lights, think is ethically problematic.
So here's an argument for thinking the bar should be a little bit lower than that. So your bar is, we all agree this is the ethical thing to do, something along those lines. I wonder if the bar can be lowered, and this is me trying on a thought, but it's a sort of thought that I'm standardly drawn to. Especially in a business context, right? Forget about, we're all on the same team, we want to build something together. It makes sense, I think, for everyone to think that we're doing something ethical. But I'm thinking in particular about, a data science company or an AI company providing services to a client, say a Fortune 500. And I guess I think that what if the bar is not we all agree what's ethical, but rather no one thinks that what the other is doing is beyond the pale, exceeds ethical guardrails. So I think that what they're doing is ethically problematic. I think it's parentheses, probably ethically wrong, but it's not a crazy position. I'd say you might characterize them as being not unreasonable in holding the ethical position that they do. And so there's an agreement to work with them given, look, we all have to, we have to do business together. People have conflicting ethical views, and we need to allow for reasonable disagreement, and we can work with those with whom we reasonably disagree.
Yeah, so I think what you're pointing to is an important subtlety that I've been gliding over, which is, do we have the expectation that everyone agrees that this is ethical, or do we have the expectation that everyone agrees that this is not unethical?
Exactly.
With the recognition that there is a large gray area, a middle ground where there can be reasonable disagreement about whether something is ethical or unethical. And so the way I was talking, it suggested that companies should stay out of that gray area. And the way you're talking suggests, well, maybe the companies should be perfectly allowed to go into that gray area, but they shouldn't go to things that they think, no, this is clearly unethical.
Yeah.
And I think that that's in practice, I think that that's a completely reasonable idea. I confess I am drawn to the thought that we should have the aspirational goal that we all agree it is ethical. And recognizing that the incentives in especially economic spaces are going to push people into that gray area. So my worry is actually a very practical one. If we start out saying the gray area is a perfectly good place to be, it's all right to live there, combine that with just historical and psychological evidence that people are going to push towards the more unethical if they think it will make money for the company, advance their careers.
Sure.
I'd rather start in a more conservative position and allow human nature to push us into the gray area than to start out in the gray area and then we get pushed into the unethical. But that's a practical argument, and I'm perfectly open to the idea that it might not be true when we think about major corporations or something like that.
I mean, there's another, I'll push a practicality argument from the other side, though, which is that if you say to a company, listen, you should do an AI ethics program or create an AI ethics program by which you make sure that whatever you're creating and rolling out and however you service other clients is up to your ethical standards. If you push it towards, you've got to agree that everyone's going to be, you have to agree, both parties or all parties involved have to agree that it's ethical. They're going to say, that's too high of a bar. We're just not, forget it. Let's just go for regulatory compliance, which is I take it to be the bare minimum. Whereas if you say, look, there's going to be gray area cases, you could deal with those gray area cases on a case manner. There are methods by which you can increase the probability, this is putting it a bit technically, but increase the probability of dealing with those gray area cases in a responsible way, in a way that lends itself to efficient and effective deliberation for those gray areas. And then I think the AI ethics program, as it were, is an easier sell. It's something that they can more see themselves getting themselves into because they're not, from the start of things, as they see it, tying their hands from innovation, from making sales, et cetera, losing market share.
Yeah, so I guess I would say I'd be perfectly happy with that structure as you've described it. I think one of the things that we've really focused on, at least in our initial writings and speakings about this topic, is simply getting people to recognize that this is an issue. I mean, it's actually striking how many people in the tech industry, but also in a lot of governmental positions where they're working with industry, but they're also working between governments. And of course, every government has now come out with their batch of AI ethics principles. And one of the things we've been really struck by, both Dan and myself, is how many people have just it's never occurred to them that there might be things that are deemed ethical by one party but not by the other, and that they need some way of figuring out, are we dealing with one of these kinds of cases? And so, if it gets people to talk and actually engage in these kinds of bilateral, multilateral discussions, great. I'm happy to do it that way. And what I worry about is people who say, well, it's almost a kind of burden of proof argument. Is the burden of proof that you have to convince me that what you're doing is not unethical? Or is it that I just assume what you're doing is fine, which is where we are right now. Right now where we are is everyone just assumes everyone else is doing something fine and then is shocked to later learn that in fact the technology was used in a problematic way. And I think at the very least we need to bring a little bit of the burden of proof over to say, you got to do some due diligence. Figure out if this is one of those cases where you should at least be talking with the other side about whether you're contributing to building a system that is problematic.
So, right. And one thing I'll just draw attention to is that it's not just procurement and it's not just your clients, but one thing that we're always telling our clients is asking them, what's the scope of this program? So is this going to apply as well to strategic partners? Is it going to apply to investors? What about in your mergers and acquisitions process? Is there going to be ethical due diligence there as well? Okay, let's come back to ethical interoperability. So I think there are really two things that you've brought to the fore. One is, I'm going to say it's a pragmatic question. Maybe it's not. I mean, it's an ethical, pragmatic question. How do we make sure, or how do we increase the probability of two or more parties signing up to the same ethical standards in building the AI and embedding the model inside of some larger solution? That's one, something like, how do we work together? And then the other is a more straightforward ethical question, which is how do we distribute blame when things go sideways, when things go ethically sideways? So if those are the two issues, let me give really simple answers to both of those questions, and then you tell me why they're oversimplified. How do we do it? Well, we just talk with each other. Here, what are your standards? Here are our standards. All right, let's sort of, if you like, negotiate, or, putting it business-like, negotiate, putting it, the way that you and I might want to deliberate together about what the standards ought to be, about what's ethically acceptable. So we just talk about it. That's a simple answer. And with the regards to the other question, how do we apportion blame when things go ethically sideways? Well, it depends on the use case. There's nothing that we can say before knowing the context of the particular way in which the AI was developed and deployed, monitored, etc. But I think
Uh,
those are oversimplified answers, so you tell me what's so simple about them.
Yeah, well, I mean, let me briefly say something about the second one and then I'll tie it back to the first. So,
Yeah.
for the second one, I think part of the challenge is that there's actually a lot of work that's been done on the apportionment of ethical responsibility when things go wrong. Now, a lot of this takes place in the context of what ethicists will sometimes refer to as the problem of many hands. When many people have been involved in something, how do we avoid the conclusion that ultimately no one is responsible for some horrific thing that occurred, right? That's the state we want to avoid ending up in. And I think that we have, in that sense, actually quite a lot of understanding about the factors that go into it. It depends on what was reasonably known by different parties at different times. It depends on how necessary or sufficient their contribution was to the state that resulted in the horrific outcome or the wonderful outcome, right? Because we also apportion praise, not just blame, across
Sure.
companies. And so, I think from that perspective, we actually have a pretty good ethical framework. It's not very good legally. I agree. There's a lot of challenges there. Often it
Sure.
seems that the blame gets apportioned based on who has the deepest pockets. But nonetheless, I think we can safely say that, there is a framework within which we can operate. But one of the things that really matters for that framework, or those ways of thinking about how to divide up the blame, is that much depends on what was known or reasonably known ahead of time. And so it actually connects directly back to this question of how do we get on the same page? So the first thing to say is that I want to make sure to be clear. I don't think that ethical interoperability requires that the different parties, the different companies, the different governments, whatever it may be, they don't need to be on the same page about what the ethical AI principles are. I think that that's too strong, and we're never going to get there because in practice, these things take enormous amounts of negotiation and time to get to happen in any one organization. And organizations don't really like it when you come and say, well, we need to change ours because this other company has a different set of principles and we want to play nice with them. Like,
Right.
nobody's going to do that, right? So,
Sure.
so I think it's important, though, to say that we don't need to have the principles be the same. What we need to agree is that a particular use case, particular technology in context for purpose, is deemed ethical by both of us. So that is much more concrete. It's about where are the overlaps. So, I mean, just to take a simple example, basically every single set of ethical AI principles is going to agree that using AI to optimize the server loads, so that I got
Yeah.
more efficient computation, energy efficiency, everyone's going to agree that's perfectly fine,
Sure.
right? And everybody's going to agree that, using facial recognition to target people in a black box way when it's inaccurate and we're going to take really nasty actions against them even though we have no confidence that it gave us the right answer. Yeah, that's bad. Don't do that.
Sure.
And so one of the things that I think is important is that the negotiations are not about the principles. They're actually about the practice. They're about the thing that we are trying to produce. And can
Sure.
we agree on that? Now, the challenge there, I think, is really twofold. The first is most of these sets of principles are underspecified. So they don't really tell us what it is that we have in mind. They sort of wave their hands in general directions to the kinds of things that we might want to create. And so these are difficult negotiations because neither side is particularly precise about what it is that they're trying to achieve. The actually, I think, bigger challenge or barrier to these negotiations is IP and trade secrets, and the fact that companies are not going to open the door to explain how they build, for example, their AI models. But nonetheless, almost all of the ethical AI principles, if you just sort of look at, any of the over 100 that are now out there, basically all of them have at least some principles that depend on how a system is built, how it is deployed and used. And so now we have the problem that the only way to really do this discussion, this negotiation, is for me to be willing to open up aspects of the design and development process that my company is not going to want to do. Even if you're not a direct competitor, I don't want to show you exactly how we're building these systems. And so, how do
Is
you
that
know that
required
they're
though?
built in a way that works?
Is that required? So you know, it seems to me, and again, I'm trying to, I want you to push back. It seems to me that even though the agreement doesn't have to happen at, if you like, the principal level or something along those lines, but rather it's about whether in this particular use case, given the particular context in which the AI is being deployed, the particular system in which it's being embedded, et cetera, is this on the ethical up and up? So can we use this facial recognition software to, let's just take the MSG example again that was in the news recently that we talked about before, to flag attorneys who are working for law firms that are suing MSG? Is that on the ethical up and up? And that discussion can happen in the absence of any talk about how you source the data, what your accuracy rates are, what your false positive rate are, what your false negative rates are. We don't need all that stuff. The ethics conversation comes before all that stuff, and it proceeds under the assumption that the technical specifications will meet such and such a bar. So don't we just have to have that, and we don't need that kind of discussion that would potentially disclose IP?
So I'd say I would push back by saying I don't think it's that the ethical discussion happens prior. I think it's that an ethical discussion happens prior. So sure, one part of it is this something we ought to be doing in the first place? But at the same time, it's also an ethical discussion about exactly how were the data sourced? What are the data? Are there biases within the data? I mean, if you give me an accuracy threshold that I have to hit on a particular test bed with my facial recognition software, almost certainly I can hit that. And then it will do terribly when I go to transfer and generalize.
Sure.
Because if you tell me what I have to do, sure, I can hit that benchmark. I'll just train on the test data and then I'm good to go. So we have to have, I think, understanding when we want to talk about things like, there's oftentimes people have ethical principles around transparency. Right?
Sure.
The idea that you can figure out where the data came from, how the data are influencing the model, what the model's doing. But that's actually a really difficult thing to figure out if you're not able to look at the development processes themselves.
Yep.
And so I think what we would have to quickly move towards is a world where we've got a lot of self-attestation, self-verification, where companies say, look, I understand what you're looking for, and yes, we have done this. We've done things that satisfy what you're looking for. And so then the challenge becomes, if we think we're going to have to move to a world that is where these kinds of interoperability claims are based on self-attestation, we're going to have to move towards a world in which we've set up the right incentives. How do we, self-attestation works all the time. That's how, for example, the braking system in a car gets approved, is that the company that produces the braking system says, they just attest, yes, we've done the test and it passes it. And then if things go wrong, then they have to prove that they did it. But they don't have to submit the materials ahead of time.
Sure.
Unlike, say, pharmaceutical drugs. And so, we know how to make this work as long as you get the incentives aligned. And right now, when we look at things like procurement and lawsuits when things go wrong, it seems pretty clear that the incentives are not aligned for the attestations to work.
Yeah.
But I also think that that's kind of a solvable policy problem. We know
Sure.
how to do this kind of thing. We just have to translate it into this domain.
Yeah, right. So the point is something like, right, have an ethical conversation at the start about the use case, context, etc. But then at the end of the day, there's going to have to be some kind of verification process. We're not, whatever that looks like, that what they said they're going to do, in fact, they did, that the data was sourced in an ethically responsible way, et cetera, et cetera. And then it seems like one path is for them to be fully transparent about all the things they built and how they used it. But that's not going to happen,
Right.
because of IP issues. Second potential is the verification or the validation comes by way of a self-attestation. And I think there's also a third option, which is something like various third-party auditors popping up. And so I could imagine a world in which, and we see this happening with the New York City law. Look, we're not interested in knowing your IP. A self-attestation is not enough. You need to have a third-party auditor who's a great keeper of secrets to verify that you've in fact done what you've said you would do. And I take it that solution, it might vary by use case and in particular the risk of the use case, right? So I could imagine a company saying self-attestation is totally fine. The stakes are relatively low, but in various high stakes applications, you might think in that case, we're going to need a third party auditor to verify. How does that sound?
Yeah, so I'm a big proponent of third-party audit, of compliance mechanisms, of these kinds of things. with one giant caveat, which is that we need to recognize and really tackle the challenge of figuring out how to operationalize, to use sort of more psychology language, operationalize our principles and our ethical demands. So I think right now there's a lot of talk of, well, we need to have audits around transparency, just to use one I used before, governability,
Sure.
or bias in the case of the New York law, and very little understanding of what that actually means.
Yeah.
We are not good yet at translate. What we really want, I think, in some sense, we want to have these. We've got these principles. We want to have ways to audit them, check for compliance, which really means asking how can we operationalize them into tests. How could we have a test to find out whether this is or is not? It's not going to be perfect, but how do we get good enough tests? And then once we have those kinds of audit compliance things, then we can come up with practices that design for the audit. Right? So I think right now there's a lot of talk of how do we go from principles to practice. I actually think operationalizations, the kinds of things audits depend on, are a really valuable middle step between principles and practice. That if we can figure out what would count as success according to that principle, then we can start to have practices where we explicitly design for that. And that's an effort that's only really just beginning. I mean, there are some groups that are starting to do this. We're seeing some ideas emerge from industry where it's being, proposals being made about here's what would satisfy it. And obviously in some sectors we see it. So we see it in employment law. It's been, the EEOC has made it very clear that at least for now, the 3/5 rule is going to continue to apply even if I'm using an automated system. So that's an operationalization of bias in that particular context. So I think that's, audit would be great, but we have to know what we're auditing for. And I do worry that right now we're seeing a bunch of audit and compliance companies and startups being created without a whole lot of clarity about what it is they're auditing for.
Yeah, I mean, it seems to me not unreasonably that what they're auditing for is that a certain process has occurred, as opposed to a certain outcome has been produced. So did you look for bias? Did you test for bias? Did you document your identification of potential sources of bias at the concept phase? Did you document the results for testing for bias at the, say the testing and validation stage, or at, pre-deployment? What were your findings? Can you give an explanation for why you chose this metric for bias instead of that one? Can you give an explanation for, when did you address whether a black box model was appropriate for this particular use case? And it's all process driven, but the problem is that there's no standards for correctness other than it's been done. Right? So did you check for bias?
Right.
Yes. Oh, okay. Did you choose a metric? Yes. Do you have a reason for them you choosing that metric? Yes, we do. It was X. But the audit company is in no position to assess whether X is a good reason for using that bias metric, or has no grounds on which to assess whether Y was a good reason for using a black box model for this particular use case. They could just verify that there was some reason given for the choice and that has been documented, but that's rather thin.
Yeah, I think the history of auditing for process compliance, the history of that is pretty clear, I think, when we look at it. It works just when we have very clear processes that have been demonstrated to lead to the outcomes that we care about.
Right.
So, a lot of the audit for, let's take things like expense reimbursement in a large organization. The audits of those do tend to focus on process. But it's because in the process, there are these 3 reasons you can give for an exception. Did you give one of these 3 things?
Yeah.
And do you have documentation for it? And so right now, of course, in AI, as is well known, we don't have best practices. We don't know what processes lead to the kinds of ethically desirable, societally beneficial outcomes that we all want. And so I agree that, right now, the audits that are being put out there, they focus on process, and we don't know what processes they should be ensuring people follow. So it's hard to see how that's going to work. I have the utmost confidence that we are, as a community, going to get to a place that we know much more about best practices, and we could move to that kind of a model. But we're not there yet, and I think we're at least 5 years away from really having it.
Okay, well, let me dig into that for a minute before we should wrap it up. So, I'm going to push a sort of simple line, and I want you to push back. We know what best practices are. So goes the argument. So goes the thought that I'm sort of trying on and want you to push against. We know what best practices are. So, at the concept phase, think about potential sources of bias, get a cross-functional team involved, get some data scientists involved, some ethicists, some sociologists, some attorneys, some civil rights people, right? Have a, deliberate about it with the right set of people. And if you've got the right set of people deliberating at about the right time, that increases the probability of getting the right answer about whether, say, a black box model is acceptable or whether there's a privacy violation by virtue of the data that we're proposing to collect or the data that we're proposing to infer, or the surveillance we're proposing to engage in, or what would count as bias or discriminatory in this particular use case. So getting that cross-functional team involved in the process, and indeed at each stage of the AI lifecycle, to have those kinds of conversations does increase the probability of getting it right. And what more could you want? Similarly with, the criminal justice system, the best, we assess whether or not the procedure's been fair because we think, okay, you have a jury of your peers, we've got certain rules for what that kind of conversation looks like or what the trial should look like. Is that the idea? We're missing something analogous to rules by which the trial ought to be conducted in the AI ethics deliberation space? Is that the issue, or?
Well, so I think it's a couple of things. The first I would say is I would actually revise what you said. I would say we all think we know what works, but we don't actually have very much evidence for it. There's remarkably little evidence showing that bringing together a cross-functional multidisciplinary team actually leads to better outcomes. We all believe it, myself included. But we actually don't have a whole lot of, good controlled evidence that this is going to work. We do have evidence that bringing people...
It might be a reasonable assumption, but we lack empirical evidence.
It might be, but we need to actually check those kinds of things. And there are some of us who are, trying to take big senior capstone projects and see if we can do controlled experiments on them. But that's another discussion. But I think the deeper issue is exactly what you were saying, which is it's not just about bringing together these people. It's about bringing them together for particular kinds of discussions that are structured in particular ways. I mean, if you put the ethicist in the room and then they're ignored, well, that's probably not going to lead to the kinds of outcomes we want. So, I know I've had the experience, I'm guessing you have as well, of talking to companies and they'll say, well, we want to do this thing. And I'll say, okay, here's all the ethical problems with that. And they go, yeah, but we really want to do that thing.
Yeah.
And I go, well, okay, I don't work here. It's not, it is legal. I can't stop you from doing it, but it's not ethical. And they go, yeah, but are you sure you can't tell us that it's ethical? And I'm like, no, I'm not going to. But, they have no interest in actually listening to what I have to say. Sure. They want to do what they want to do, and they wanted the cover for it, right? So that's just a very simplistic, extreme example of the fact that it's not just about who's in the room, it's about what happens in the room. And there we really, I don't think, have any good understanding of what the better practices are for trying to get to better outcomes. Beyond banalities like listen to other people, learn to communicate across disciplinary and boundaries and across perspectives. Those things, but that doesn't translate into anything that an auditor could come in and do, could check for.
So again, me pushing back, trying on a thought. That's what we get with juries, right? We think that we ought to have juries. There's no, as far as I know, there's no formal rules by which juries are required to deliberate. They throw the jurors in a room. There's a foreman or a foreperson. They talk about it. They hash it out. It's, there's the good, the bad, and the ugly. And then we just go with that.
So my understanding is that there at least are some rules about what can be discussed and what can't. I would actually, this may be a controversial thing to suggest, but I would actually suggest that I think jury decisions and jury deliberations would be improved if there were a little bit of structure provided to them. Yeah. I understand why we err on the side of not putting that structure on. But nonetheless, I think that it would be improved. Now, I say this as somebody who has never been selected for a jury, and I would imagine they would look and say, philosophy professor, we don't want you anywhere near a jury.
But you've seen 12 Angry Men, you get it.
Oh, sure, yeah, no, exactly. No, and so, but I think it's a good example where we might have good reasons not to put a lot of structure, but we shouldn't thereby claim that this is the better way to do it. It may well be that there are better ways that we could have juries function. Yeah. That in the sense, better in the sense of being more likely to yield an accurate and just outcome. And I think we should, personally, I think that in tech, we should embrace the opportunity to experiment and to try different ways of developing technology. I was not actually joking when I was saying that, one of the things I would love to do is is we require senior capstone project teams here at UC San Diego for all the data science majors. I mean, I would love to do a kind of semi-controlled experiment where we shape the groups and we put some people together that have a more multidisciplinary background, some that are just straight data science and statistics, and look to see, are they better, are the multidisciplinary groups better able to identify ethical concerns about the projects that they're doing for their capstone? I think that'd be wonderful to get to do. There's a whole lot of complications, but I think we need to embrace this. Exactly. And I think, so in that sense, I think we need to embrace the spirit of experimentation and not just become complacent that, well, the way we've always done it is what's going to work, or it's obvious that, something is going to help.
Yeah. So let me try to sort of pull this stuff together. So we've got this problem or issue of ethical interoperability. There's at least, I think, two sides to that coin. One has to do with, are the different teams sort of talking about settling on the ethical permissibility of what they're doing? Or is there some degree of consensus among the various teams that what they're doing is on the ethical up and up? Second issue pertains to apportioning responsibility across those teams, let alone individuals who are members of those various teams. And I take it that part of what you're saying is one thing that we need are better means for something like we need best practices, empirically grounded conclusions about what constitute best practices for what those conversations look like. And then it might be the case that responsibility is going to be distributed to the extent that different teams or different members of those teams actually engage or flout those best practices for what the conversation ought to look like.
I think that would be an amazing world if we could end up there.
Sure. I'd say, yeah.
And I say it that way because, here as we come to the close of the conversation, I do want to make sure to emphasize that this is still early days. To the best of Dan's and my ability to figure it out, the term ethical interoperability doesn't appear before a talk that I gave about a year and a half ago, or 2 years ago. You just don't see this term being used. And so one thing that would count as a small win is just to get people to recognize that it is an issue. That they can't just think about, what's the API that my software is going to be able to call on your end. They can't just think about those kinds of technical questions. They have to think about the ethical, or else we are basically shirking our responsibilities to our own ethical commitments, either corporate or professional or personal.
Yeah. All right. Well, David, thank you once again for a great discussion. Once again, you're required to return, and I'm looking forward to our next discussion.
Once again, it was fun as always, Reed, and I'm back anytime you want me.
Great. All right. Talk to you later.
Thanks.